Going live. 3, 2, 1. All right, continuing. This is the Science of Logic section on the idea, chapter 1, life, the immediate idea. The idea of life has to do with a subject matter so concrete, and if you will, so real, that in dealing with it one may seem, according to the common notion of logic, to have overstepped its boundaries. Needless to say, if the logic were to contain nothing but empty, dead forms of thought, then there could be no talk in it at all of such a content as the idea, or life, are. But if the subject matter of logic is the absolute truth, and truth as such lies essentially in cognition, then cognition at least would have to come in for consideration. It is common practice to have the so-called pure logic be followed by an applied logic, a logic that has to do with concrete cognition, quite apart from all the psychology and anthropology that is commonly deemed necessary to interpolate into logic. But the anthropological and psychological side of cognition is concerned with the form in which cognition appears when the concept does not as yet have an objectivity equal to it, that is, when it does not have itself as object. The part of the logic that deals with this concrete cognition does not belong to applied logic as such. If it did, then every science would have to be dragged into logic, for each is an applied logic insofar as it consists in apprehending its subject matter in forms of thought and of concepts. The subjective concept has presuppositions that are exhibited in psychological, anthropological, and other forms, but the presuppositions of the pure concept belong in logic only to the extent that they have the form of pure thoughts, of abstract essentialities, such as are the determinations of being and essence. The same goes for cognition, which is the concept's comprehension of itself. No other shape of its presupposition but the one which is itself idea is to be dealt with in the logic. This, however, is a presupposition which is necessarily treated in logic. This presupposition is now the immediate idea. For while cognition is the concept insofar as the latter exists for itself, but as a subjectivity referring to an objectivity, then the concept refers to the idea as presupposed or as immediate. But the immediate idea is life. Alright, now I can understand, like, on a general level what he means by presuppose here. But the specific technicalities, since I haven't read the essence, where positing and was explicitly clear, can't say I fully understand it. But it should not be too much of a problem. Life. To this extent, the necessity of considering the idea of life in logic would be based on the necessity itself recognized in other ways of treating the concrete concept. But this idea has arisen through the concept's own necessity. The idea, that which is true in and for itself, is essentially the subject matter of the logic, since it is first to be considered in its immediacy, so that this treatment be not an empty affair devoid of determination. It is to be apprehended and cognized in this determinateness in which it is life. A comment may be made in order here to differentiate the logical view of life from any other scientific view of it, though this is not the place to concern ourselves with how life is treated in non-philosophical sciences, but only with how to differentiate logical life as idea from natural life as treated in the philosophy of nature, and from life insofar as it is bound to spirit. As treated in the philosophy of nature, as the life of nature, and to that extent exposed to the externality of existence, life is conditioned by inorganic nature, and its moments as idea are a manifold of actual shapes. Life in the idea is without such presuppositions, which are in shapes of actuality. Its presupposition is the concept, as we have considered it, on the one hand as subjective, and on the other hand as objective. In nature, life appears as the highest stage that nature's externality can attain, by withdrawing into itself and sublating itself in subjectivity. It is in logic the simple in itselfness, which in the idea of life has attained the externality truly corresponding to it. The concept that came on the scene earlier as a subjective concept is the soul of life itself. It is the impulse that gives itself reality through a process of objectification. Nature, as it reaches this idea starting from its externality, transcends itself. Its end is not its beginning, but is for it as a limit in which it ablates itself. Similarly, in the idea of life, the moments of life's reality do not receive the shape of external actuality, but remain enveloped in conceptual form. Alright, I need to read that a bit more slowly because it's pretty dense. So let's do. So obviously this is not talking about the natural idea of life, which what we would call organic life, from inorganic elements. So, no DNA involved here, nothing of that sort. What is it? As treated in the philosophy of nature as life of nature, to that extent exposed to the externality of existence, life is conditioned by inorganic nature and its moments, ideas, manifold celestial shapes. Life in the idea is without such presuppositions, which are in shapes of actuality. Its presupposition is the concept as we have considered it, on the one hand as subjective and on the other hand as objective. In nature, life appears as the highest stage that nature's externality can attain by withdrawing into itself and sublating itself in subjectivity. It is in logic the simple in itselfness, which in the idea of life has attained the externality truly corresponding to it. The concept that came on the scene earlier as a subjective concept is the soul of life itself. It is the impulse that gives itself reality through a process of objectification. Oh, okay. So whereas natural life is objects resubsumed into subjective unity, logical life is the opposite. It's the in itselfness of subjectivity objectified. That's interesting. Though it's not reduced to objectivity as such, but it's sort of like the concept or the soul run through or sublated through objectivity, one might say, in its immediacy. Nature, as it reaches this idea starting from its externality, transcends itself. Its end is not its beginning, but is for it as a limit in which it sublates itself. Similarly, in the idea of life, the moments of life's reality do not receive the shape of external actuality, but remain enveloped in conceptual form.
Yeah, I think this is tricky. Like, part of how I might try and understand this is like this is just life in general. It's not going to be plant life versus animal life versus the various configurations of objectivity that life finds itself in, like, say, discussing organs, specifically between animals and stuff like that. It seems to be just the most, yeah. Life without all of the variegated conditions involved in life.
Yeah, I mean, it's pure life as such, as opposed to a conditional life. Because by this concept of life, everything else can be considered living, properly speaking. The activity of space is to the extent of which space is spatial and space is a life of space. An atom, insofar as it's a self-unifying material entity, which has some sort of substantiating dynamic is to that extent life. So this is a more general concept of life in which life is just this self-objectifying, self-substantiating activity or soul or subjectivity. Although that last little bit, he says, nature as it reaches this idea starting from its externality transcends itself. Its end is not its beginning, but is for it as a limit in which it sublates itself. With the achievement of life, you have a boundary moment in which, like, where you're at is no longer, properly speaking, natural. But it's not yet, properly speaking, spiritual. It's literally a limit moment. He says, similarly, in the idea of life, the moments of life's reality do not receive the shape of external actuality, but remain enveloped in a conceptual form. Oh, okay. So that just means, whereas in nature, nature starts with externality and life goes into internality. With the idea of life, we already have internality, because we developed that in the concept, and then the object is just sort of the obverse of that, and then with the idea in immediacy, we're right back into the internality of the concept. So it has the same function of internality that it does in nature. So that makes sense. In spirit, however, life appears both as opposed to it and as posited as at one with it. In a unity, reborn is the pure product of spirit, for life is here to be taken generally in its proper sense as natural life. For what is called the life of spirit as spirit is spirit's own peculiar nature that stands opposed to mere life. Just as we speak of the nature of spirit, even though spirit is nothing natural, but stands rather in opposition to nature. Thus, life as such is for spirit in one respect a means, and then spirit holds it over against itself. In another respect, spirit is an individual, and then life is its body. In yet another respect, this unity of spirit and its living corporeality is born of spirit into ideality. None of these connections of life to spirit concerns logical life, and life is to be considered here neither as the instrument of a spirit, nor as a living body, nor again as a moment of the ideal and of beauty. In both cases, as natural life and as referring to spirit, life obtains a determinateness from its externality. In one case through its presuppositions, such as are other formations of nature, and in the other case through the purposes and the activity of spirit. The idea of life by itself is free from both the conditioning objectivity presupposed in the first case and the reference to subjectivity of the second case. Life, considered now more closely in its idea, is in and for itself absolute universality. The objectivity which it possesses is throughout permeated by the concept, and this concept alone has and this concept alone it has as substance. Whatever is distinguished as part, or by some otherwise external reflection, has the whole concept within it. The concept is the soul omnipresent in it, a soul which is simple self-reference, and remains one in the manifoldness that accrues to the objective being. This manifoldness, as self-external objectivity, has an indifferent subsistence, which in space and time, if these could already be mentioned here, is a mutual externality of entirely diverse and atomistic matters. But externality is in life at the same time as the simple determinateness of its concept. Thus, the soul flows omnipresently in this manifold, but remains at the same time the simple oneness of the concrete concept with itself. That way of thinking that clings to the determinations of reflective relations and of the formal concept, when it comes to consider life, the unity of its concept in the externality of objectivity, the absolute multiplicity of atomistic matter, finds that all its thoughts are absolutely of no avail. The omnipresence of the simple in the manifold externality is for reflection and absolute contradiction, and also, since it cannot at the same time avoid witnessing this omnipresence in the perception of life, and must therefore grant the actuality of this idea, is an incomprehensible mystery. For reflection does not grasp the concept, nor does it grasp it as the substance of life. But this simple life is not only omnipresent, it is the one and only subsistence and immanent substance of its objectivity, but as subjective substance it is impulse, more precisely the specific impulse of particular difference, and no less essentially the one and universal impulse of the specific that leads its particularization back to unity and holds it there. Only as this negative unity of its objectivity and particularization is life self-referring, life that exists for itself, a soul. As such, it is essentially a singular that refers to objectivity as to an other, an inanimate nature. The originative judgment of life consists therefore in this, that it separates itself off as an individual subject from the objective, and, since it constitutes itself as the negative unity of the concept, makes the presupposition of an immediate objectivity. Okay. So in this huge paragraph, or actually in the last two paragraphs, it seems to me he has literally talked about life in completely different, like, opposite ways. Like, first he says, like, oh, well, life is the immediate individuality, and then he says, no, it's the absolute universality, which still makes sense for being individuality. Then he says, life is the immediate that objectification of the concept, and here it's saying, no, it's the originative only as this negative unity of its objectivity and particularization as life self-referring. So life then is not the immediate individuality as such, but actually the mediating universality of the elements of life, and therefore is not the objectification of the soul, but is actually also the soul or the ensouling of the object. But that's part of the course for Hegel. This is how everything works. I don't know. Makes sense to me. Doesn't make complete sense because I haven't read the rest of the logic of the concept, which would explain much of this in far more detail, as well as the essence. But most of this is very intelligible to me. Life is a judgment insofar as life is this process of making distinctions within itself. It's, judgments for Hegel are just like this, like something like, being is essence or whatever. That's a judgment. And how's it a judgment? The is, the copula, sets both the difference and the identity, the particularity in the whole, and forms syllogisms. Alright, now we seem to be getting on with life. First, life is therefore to be considered as a living individual, that is, for itself the subjective totality, and is presupposed as indifferent to an objectivity that stands indifferent over against it. Alright, seems clear to me. Alright, so that returns to what you were saying earlier. First, life is to be considered as a living individual, that is for itself the subjective totality, and is presupposed as indifferent to an objectivity that stands indifferent over and against it. Second, it is the life process of sublating its presupposition, of positing as negative the objectivity indifferent to it, and of actualizing itself as the power and negative unity of this objectivity. By doing so, it makes itself into the universal, which is the unity of itself and its other. Third, consequently, life is the genus process, the process of sublating its singularization and relating itself to its objective existence as to itself. Accordingly, this process is, on the one hand, the turning back to its concept and the repetition of the first forcible separation, the coming to be of a new individuality and the death of the immediate first. But on the other hand, the withdrawing into itself of the concept of life is the becoming of the concept that relates itself to itself, of the concept that exists for itself, universal and free, the transition into cognition. All right, so that was just the introduction to life. Any thoughts? Guess not.
I'm all good.
I can only say I'm curious as to how like he makes that movement at the end of the Genus process to cognition. Formally,
tricky.
Formally, it makes sense to me, but I definitely not quite sure about the concreteness of it. I mean, if I could speculate in the bad sense about it, let's see. Third, consequently, life is the genus process, the process of sublating itself into sublating its singularization, relating itself to its objective existence as to itself. Accordingly, this process is on the one hand the turning back to its concept and the repetition of the first forcible separation, the coming to be of a new individuality, the death of the immediate first, but on the other hand, the withdrawing into itself of the concept of life is the becoming of the concept that relates itself to itself, of the concept that exists for itself, universal and free, the transition to cognition. Because the weird thing is to me, like, at least what he's describing here seems to me like it would also just fit with the immediacy at the end of the concept and objectivity coming together. That also, you could say like, oh well, I can't just jump that directly to cognition. But I think that the explanation for why life has to be inserted here is because taking it in its pure immediacy, it does make sense that that seeing how this process objectively plays out as that movement from subjectivity to objectivity and back again, life does fit as something between that immediacy and the immediacy which is cognition, and that if we didn't have life here, we would be missing something in the account of just how immediate this can actually be. All right, A, the living individual. The concept of life, or universal life, is the immediate idea, the concept that has an objectivity corresponding to it, but the objectivity corresponds to it only to the extent that the concept is the negative unity of this externality, that is to say, posits it as corresponding to the totality of the concept. A totality, however, that has the subjectivity of the concept, or its negative unity, standing over against it, and this subjectivity or negativity is what constitutes the true centrality, that is to say, the concept's free unity with itself. This subject is the idea in the form of singularity, as simple but negative self-identity, the living individual. Okay, yeah, so this makes sense already, that we have the living individual, which or rather it's the organic individual, in the sense that it is already like a, if one put in the analogy, multicellular from the beginning. Although not really. Multicellular would be the wrong one.
Not cell, but like
it's already organized. I mean, it's got organs, but the organs themselves are not living. But it's determinate. It's determinate to organic. Well, I mean, that's why organisms are called organic to begin with. They're composed of parts with purposes. That's what an organ is. So here, it's like a single-celled organism, but and the moments would be the organs. And while organs themselves are not living, they are themselves organs as objects insofar as they're part of that living process. Otherwise, they would just be mere dead chemicals.
Yeah, the diversity, like the objective diversity, is its body, but the relationships, which is a holistic relation, which is one, are the movement within that body, which isn't like localizable to this or that spot. It's that the movement of all of those discrete objective moments forms a relational totality, which is one with itself and permeates its entire objectivity.
Yeah, I would say so. So this individual is in the first place life as soul, as the concept of itself, fully determined within itself, the initiating self-moving principle. In its simplicity, the concept contains determined externality, as a simple moment enclosed within itself. But further, this soul is in its immediacy, immediately external, and has an objective being within it, a reality which is subjugated to purpose, the immediate means, at first the objectivity which is predicated of the subject, but then also the middle term of the syllogism, for the corporeality of the soul is that whereby the soul links itself to external objectivity. The living being has this corporeality. That's a weird translation. Usually it would be corporeality. At first as a reality immediately identical with the concept. To this extent, corporeality has this reality in general by nature. Okay, I'm going to reread that slowly. This individual is in the first place life as soul, as the concept of itself, fully determined within itself, the initiating self-moving principle. Okay, that makes sense insofar as the immediate living individual is this process of the subsumption of the body under this unifying principle. So that makes total sense. In its simplicity, the concept contains determinate externality as a simple moment enclosed within itself. The totality of the soul posits its elements of a body. But further, this soul is in its immediacy immediately external and has an objective being within it. A reality which is subjugated to purpose, that immediate means, at first the objectivity which is predicated of the subject, but then also the middle term of the syllogism. For the corporeality of the soul is that whereby the soul links itself to external objectivity. So here Hegel places himself against all those people who would think that the soul and the body can be two different things of different, it's like two substances of different natures, like Descartes, typical dualism. And Hegel says, no, that makes no sense. The very concept, the meaning of and the intelligibility of what it is to be a soul is to be, this immediate embodiment, which is organized by the soul. Like it's what Aristotle says. Aristotle says the soul is the form of the body itself, or the forming of the body, or you could call it the informing of the body. There can be no meaning to soul beyond that. Anyone who thinks of the soul as some other entity is not understanding what the soul as such is. They're just thinking of a different kind of body. They're not actually thinking of the soul.
Yeah, it's in its body, because it's omnipresent in its body. It's objective to itself and all of the various differences in the body. But these differences are preyed upon by one another, basically. Like the body is, you could say, preying upon itself, or you could say it's harmonized with itself. It's overtaking its own objectivity as the process of reinstantiating its objectivity and itself as soul by being the movement between them. And then that way it's present in all its elements, but all its elements are present at once in a singular manner.
Yeah, it says the living being has its corporeality at first as a reality immediately identical with the concepts. Its body, the body and the soul are immediately identical. What is objective is the concept itself. What is embodied is the soul itself. To this extent, the corporeality has this reality in general by nature, and I'm pretty sure by the emphasis of nature there is sort of an allusion to natural life, for example, not just the conceptual life here.
Yeah, the line. But further, this soul is in its immediacy, immediately external, and has an objective being within it, a reality which is subjugated to purpose. So it's subjugating itself, taking itself up as an immediate means. At first, the objectivity which is predicated of the subject. But then, it's treating its body as an object. But then also, the middle term of the syllogism for the corporeality of the soul is that whereby the soul links itself to external objectivity.
Yeah, whenever he mentions the middle term, it's the sublative term. So, the soul is its own direction and the very positing of, an externality to itself, within itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that externality is internal to it.
Yeah.
Now, because this objectivity is the predicate of the individual and is taken up in the subjective unity, the earlier determinations of the objects do not attach to it, not the relation of mechanism or of chemism, and even less so the reflective relations of whole and part and the like. As externality, it is indeed capable of such relations, but to that extent it is no longer a living being. When a living thing is taken to be a whole consisting of parts, something exposed to the action of mechanical or chemical causes, itself a mechanical or chemical product, whether merely as such or also determined by some external purpose, then the concept is taken as external to it, the individual itself as something dead. Since the concept is immanent in it, the purposiveness of the living being is to be grasped as inner. It is present in it as a determinate concept, distinguished from its externality, but in thus distinguishing itself from it, pervading it thoroughly and self-identical. This objectivity of the living being is the organism. It is the means and instrument of purpose, fully purposive, for the concept constitutes its substance. But precisely for this reason, this means and instrument is itself the accomplished purpose, in which the subjective purpose thus immediately closes in upon itself. As for its externality, the organism is a manifold, not of parts, but of members. These members exist as such only in the individuality. They are separable inasmuch as they are external and can be grasped in this externality, but as thus separated, they revert to mechanical and chemical relations of common objectivity. All right. B. Their externality is opposed to the negative unity of the living individuality. This individuality is therefore the impulse to posit as a concrete real difference the otherwise abstract moment of the determinateness of the concept. And since this concretely real difference exists as immediate, and it is the impulse of each singular specific moment to produce itself, and equally to raise its particularity to universality, to sublate the other moments external to it and promote itself at their cost, but no less to sublate itself and make itself a means for the other.
Yeah, so all the various differentiations of its members are self-reproducing, but also self-consuming in relation to one another. The organism as a whole is a totality of self-reproduction. Overturning itself is its way of maintaining itself. It persists in its change, its growth.
Yeah. I was thinking about how life cannot be considered under the terms of mere objectivity are very good points. Difference between parts and members, difference between the mechanical and chemical.
Yeah, insofar as it's like really separable, it ceases to be life.
Yeah, that this individuality is therefore the impulse to posit as concretely real difference, the otherwise abstract moment of the determinants of the concept. And since this concretely real difference exists as immediate, it is the impulse of each singular specific moment to produce itself, and equally to erase its particularity and universality, to split the other moments external to it and promote itself at their cost, but not split itself, make itself. This, in other words, is just like this is a recapitulation of what I know he develops in the logic of the concept, that particular chapter, in which like this is just like the parts exist for the whole and the whole exists for the parts, and only insofar as each part is the movement towards the production of other parts, which are the movement together as a totality for the production of the whole, and the whole is nothing but the recapitulation of the production of the individuals for themselves, which I would say is the concrete meaning of what he means by the self-reference of life. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
You want me to read? Or
oh no, I thought you said you had something to comment there.
Nope. All good. Good to go.
All right. 2. This process of the living individuality is restricted to itself and still falls entirely within the individuality. The first premise of the syllogism of external purposiveness, where the purpose immediately refers to objectivity and makes it a means, was earlier taken in the sense that although in it the purpose remains self-equal and has gone back into itself, the objectivity has not yet sublated itself within, and consequently the purpose is not in and for itself, but becomes such only in the conclusion. The process of the living being with itself is the same premise, but insofar as the premise is also the conclusion, insofar as the immediate reference of the subject to the objectivity, by virtue of which the latter becomes means and instrument, is at the same time the negative unity of the concept with itself. The purpose realizes itself in this externality by being the subjective power over it, and the process in which the externality displays its self-dissolution and its return to this negative unity of the purpose. The unrest and immutability of the external side of the living being is the manifestation in it of the concept, and the concept, as in itself negativity, has objectivity insofar as its objectivity's indifferent subsistence shows itself to be self-sublating. Thus, the concept produces itself through its impulse in such a way that the product, being its essence, is itself the producing factor. Its is product, in other words, only as an externality that equally posits itself negatively or as the process of production. All this talk of production reminds me of a certain communist. Certain mode of production. Yeah, I don't know if Marx himself mentions that. The second of determination, the concept of particularity, this is a moment of positive difference, the opening up of the negativity otherwise locked up in simple self-feeling or present in its abstract ideal, not yet concretely real determinants. It is irritability. Because of the abstraction of its negativity, feeling is impulse. It determines itself. The self-determination of the living being is its judgment, or the self-limiting, whereby it refers to the outside as to a presupposed objectivity with which it is reciprocal to. Oh, okay. So there's feeling. Feeling is like a becoming, in which like feeling has to resolve into something. Like the purpose in the immanent reality of feeling is to be irritated, is to like to be caused by some external thing to react to it.
Yeah, it's like sensation is a two-way movement. This aspect of receptivity, wherein it is irritated, and there's the aspect of responsiveness or irritability, wherein it is responding to irritation. But these are simultaneous moments where, shoot, I had it a minute ago. Yeah. The outer stimulates itself to the inner, and the inner stimulates itself to the outer. It's like a confluence.
Yeah. So then the living being as a particular now stands on one side as one species next to other species. The formal reflection of this indifferent diversity into itself is the formal genus and its systematization. But the individual reflection is this that is outwardly directed the particularity, the negativity of living being's determinateness, is the self-referring negativity of the concept. I'm not sure if that's a new movement.
This is the hardest part. Every time I try and do organism is the genus part, where I'm trying to figure out when I read it how the relationship between that confluence of externality and internality provides I feel called to think of a separate internality, externality, or another organism of its genus. The way in which that imminently occurs on account of what's happened here is tricky for me.
I mean, this is reminding me of what happens with something in which we go into something with determination, being in itself, being for other, determination, constitution. So it seems that was self-feeling and irritability. We've gone into the living individual, the objective living being, and now we've provided the internal determinations, and now we're stepping back again, and we're seeing that we had two living beings, just like the something another. Now this determinate living being, this irritable and self-feeling living being, is now a species faced now by the other, which is another species.
Yeah, they feel each other, and so they form a mutual inner and outer between them, which would be genus. It's like the sensation between them that they share.
That could work. But I'm thinking this like literally on the sense of like, okay, we've got two living individuals. We've determined that they're self-feeling, that they're irritable. We stand back, take them as that objectivity of that movement. We have two individuals. This is the meaning of what it is to be now a species. And so now we have two species, and then the negative unity of species, that self-differentiation or the indifferent diversity, the indifferent difference is genus, what is it? The formal reflection of this indifferent diversity into itself is the formal genus and its systematization. But the individual reflection is this, that is outwardly directed the particularity, the negativity of living being's determinateness, is the self-referring negativity of the concept. Okay, so that makes sense to me. According to this third determination, the living being is a singular. This immanent reflection further determines itself in such a way that in irritability, the living being is the external of itself, as against the objectivity that it possesses immediately as its means and instrument, in which is externally determinable. The immanent reflection sublates this immediacy on the one side as theoretical reflection, that is, insofar as the negativity is the simple moment of sensibility as was considered in the latter, and which constitutes feeling. On the other side is real reflection, in that unity of the concept posits itself in its externality as negative unity, and this is reproduction. The two first moments, sensibility and irritability, are abstract determinations. In reproduction, life is something concrete and vital. In it alone does it have the feeling and power of resistance. Reproduction is the negativity as simple moment of sensibility, and irritability is only a vital power of resistance, so that the relation of the external is reproduction and identity of the individual with itself. Each singular moment is essentially the totality of all. Their difference constitutes the ideal determination of form, which is posited in reproduction as the concrete totality of the whole. On the one hand, therefore, this whole is opposed to the previous determinate totalities as a third, namely as a concretely real totality. On the other hand, however, it is their implicit essentiality and also that in which they are comprehended as moments and where they have their subject and subsistence. Okay. Rereading that. According to this third determination, according to this third determination, the living being is a singular. So I would assume, well, it makes sense that he just talked about the genus. The genus would be that individual. That the true individual life is not the species, but the genus. According to this immanent reflection further determines itself in such a way that in irritability, the living being is the externality of itself as against itself. Okay, for some reason, they just clicked with me. This is why he said it was external. Because in feeling, and irritability, despite it being like the most internal thing, it also is an experience that is very clearly external. To feel is to feel something other than yourself, which is weird. Nonetheless, it is exactly what we understand by that. And obviously, to be irritated or to be irritable is also to be in relation to externality.
Mm-hmm.
In such a way that in irritability, the living being is in the externality of itself, as against the objectivity that it possesses immediately as its means and instrument, and which is externally determinable. The immanent reflection sublates this immediacy on the one side as theoretical reflection. That is, insofar as the negativity, the simple moment of sensibility, as was considered in the latter, and which constitutes feeling, on their side of real reflection. Oh, okay, so this is sort of one of those prelude comments that he makes. He's talking about theoretical reproduction and identity of the individual itself. All right, so reproduction is then the further level of this, right? The further, what would you call? The further unity of irritability and
sensibility.
Sensibility, self-feeling. So it seems to me what's happened here is that we've had two concept paths in one go, just like how multiple concepts can arise. So here, we started talking about the irritability thing, and then he shifted sideways towards the concept of species and genus. And then this is, this is happening on the same level of reproduction. So reproduction is like a side determination along with, a concurrent determination along with the genus.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Each singular moment is essentially the totality of all. Their difference constitutes the ideal determination of form, which is posited in reproduction as the concrete totality of the whole. On the one hand, therefore, the whole is opposed to the previous determinate totalities as a third, namely as a concretely real totality. On the other hand, however, it is in their implicit essentiality also that in which they are comprehended as moments, where they have their subject and subsistence. This makes sense. This is reproduction and the genus share the same dynamic form, just for a different purpose, or a different level of determinacy, in which to be a genus is to be a self-reproducing thing. And then, what does it produce? Well, it produces a species, but what are the species doing? Also self-producing and self-reproducing. So, therefore, the whole is opposed to the previous determined totalities as a third, namely as concretely real totality. On the other hand, however, it is their implicit essentiality, and also in that in which they are comprehended as moments and where they have their subject and subsistence. So the genus produces the genus again as individuals. With reproduction as a moment of singularity, the living being posits itself as actual individuality, a self-referring being for itself, but it is at the same time a real outward reference, the reflection of particularity or irritability as against an other, as against the objective world. The life process enclosed within the individual passes over into a reference to the presupposed objectivity as such, by virtue of the fact that as the individual posits itself as subjective totality, the moment of its determinateness, its reference to externality, also becomes a totality. All right, so that wasn't bad. For just jumping in that from completely far back in the logic of being in the first two chapters, this was not very unintelligible.